Ashley, if there was one message that you'd like people to take away from this conversation, what might it be?
I think the most important thing is that as adults, our ability to model what we're looking to see out of our children can't be understated. It really is important that we learn to show our children through our actions and through our words the types of behaviors and responses that we want to see from them.
Perhaps you could share a little bit about your background and the kind of work that you do.
Yeah, so I started out as a special education teacher. I worked in alternative schools, so schools for the quote unquote bad kids, but really they were kids who had experienced pretty significant traumas, enough so that doing school and academics was difficult for them. I did that until I got pregnant with my oldest child, and I wasn't sure I could be the parent I wanted to be while also being the teacher that I needed to be. So I went back to school for counseling, which was the part of teaching in alternative schools that I liked best anyways.
Hey there, if you'd like to support this show and help us continue producing this kind of content, please visit startwithvalues.com. There's a link in the show notes, and pre-order my forthcoming book. It's packed full of tools, insights, techniques to help you live a values-aligned life, to reduce stress, increase fulfillment, and it makes a great gift. So perhaps it's something you could share with someone else who you care about. That would mean the absolute world to me. Thank you again and all the best. Let's get back to the episode.
And I did my internship in the juvenile detention center where I had some of my past students. And I realized that I could not advocate for my clients in the ways that I wanted to or needed to. I didn't have the right letters after my name to be taken seriously. I was told that without a PhD or an MD, that my voice advocating for my clients really wasn't going to be heard. So I went back for my doctorate in psychology. So I have a doctorate in counseling psychology, and I focused predominantly on children and adolescents. But the thing about working with children and adolescents is that you also, to do it right, you're working with all of the domains that they navigate through in their lives. So you're working with teachers, you're working with parents, you're working with community members. So through my work with children, I also leaned into supporting the adults who care for and care about the children to better support the child. And in that space, I found myself working for a nonprofit that addresses child sex trafficking and sexual exploitation, and really looking at how do we provide appropriate services for kids who have experienced really traumatic events in a way that values them as a whole person and not just as a survivor or a victim. And how do we bolster the communities to support these children as well?
Excellent. So building resilience is obviously an important component of that. Before we dive into how you support young people in building resilience, what does resilience mean to you?
So I lean more in towards, and I think you've spoken about this concept in the past, into the idea of antifragility as opposed to resilience, the idea of post-traumatic growth, that somebody can become better and stronger than they were prior to. So resilience at its core is bouncing back. I lean more towards resilience as the idea of antifragility, bouncing not just back, but becoming stronger as a result of the experiences that you had, integrating them into the sense of self and becoming a better, more well-rounded person as a result of that.
So from your experience, how can we increase resilience in young people?
Let them make mistakes, let them fall down. It's kind of counterintuitive to Western culture currently, where we want to protect our kids from all the hard things. We don't want our kids to feel sad, to feel lonely, to feel any emotional pain. But the reality is that if we don't allow children to experience pain or discomfort or adversity, they're never going to build resilience. They're never going to learn how to cope. I mean, it starts from the very beginning with babies and teaching them through co-regulation to be able to sleep on their own, to be able to wait that 10 minutes for the bottle, to sit in the discomfort of a dirty diaper for a few minutes.
Hey there, Brad here, and this is not an ad. This is me saying thank you for connecting with this podcast. I would like to offer you a free gift. If you visit bradleyhook.com/gift, you'll find something very special there just for you. Now back to the episode.
And when we're doing that, we're teaching them through our own modeling that, yes, it's uncomfortable right now, but we'll fix it. You can trust the adults to fix it eventually, but not to do it right away. And that goes on through childhood. Part of developmental stages is really to learn that I control my own body, I control my consequences. If adults fix all the situations to where there are no consequences, then we have young adults out in the work world trying to build lasting relationships that have never learned that their actions have consequences, and they never learn how to deal with the discomfort and the sadness and the emotional pain that comes from having those consequences.
So enable them to get comfortable with being uncomfortable. Don't try and solve every problem. And there is a real tendency. I see it in myself sometimes. I'll help you solve that problem. Don't worry, it's all going to be fine. Instead of that, it's just, hey, yeah, this has happened. And let them process it, but be there to support as needed.
Yeah, there's actually an author from, I think, the 1950s. His last name's Winnicott, Dr. Winnicott, and he wrote a really powerful book about good enough parenting is good enough. And it really resonates with me in my own parenting and in my support of people who support youth. This idea that there's no such thing as perfect parenting, and that actually the more that you try to become the perfect parent to fix all the problems, there's actually kind of the law of diminishing returns, where it stops being helpful for your child because they're not learning to problem solve. They're not learning to cope. If you fix all the problems, they don't learn how to do that themselves. So even when you let them fall, you let them lean into the discomfort, you also have to keep yourself from immediately jumping into problem solving mode and let them try to figure it out themselves first, and then give the parenting talks and the support, or give them space to come ask you. You have to kind of sit back and say, that's a really bad idea, but not say it out loud, and let them do that. Because again, there's another saying, little kids, little problems, big kids, big problems. You want them to gain those skills when the worst thing that happens is that they scrape their knee or somebody calls them mean on the playground, as opposed to the real problematic outcomes that could happen when they're teenagers and young adults.
Do you think this is why there is an anxiety epidemic amongst young people? Because there was a generation of parents that just tried to solve problems and constantly be there and guide them. And I know that's a big and loaded question, but a lot of research points to the fact that there is a generation of extremely anxious young people.
I get where the parents are coming from. Every generation of parents wants to provide a life that was better for their kids than what they experienced themselves. And for this generation of parents, slightly older than I am, the worst thing that happened to them in their lives was that they felt unseen or unheard, or their feelings weren't taken into account. Most of them were fed, were clothed, physically safe. And so they're trying to make life better for their child by making sure their child doesn't have those hurt feelings without realizing the consequences. I know there's a lot out there that says that the COVID pandemic is what led to this high level of anxiety, high level of suicidality. But I was seeing it before COVID, and I was working in high schools as a school psychologist. It was happening already. COVID just put it into hyperdrive and put it more into focus. But the anxiety and the inability to sit in discomfort was happening before COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I've heard in our work as well. It's really sad that you get young people who have experienced very little adversity over the course of childhood, and then they become a teenager and suddenly they're exposed to potential criticism, bullying, perhaps online. And because they haven't built up resilience, they kind of give up or check out, or, there's many ways of doing this. On the extreme end is suicide, and on the other end is just playing video games and being socially anxious. Part of being a better parent is letting them experience some adversity throughout their childhood, let them solve problems. The tendency is, my child is bored. Okay, I'll go and play with them. I mean, I remember as a child, an adult never sat down and played with me. Whereas I notice in other parents that we all play with our kids all the time, which is interesting. Instead of letting them get bored, or potentially helping them to deal with problems at school. You having this relationship problem with your friend, I'll go and speak to their parents. No, just let them figure it out, right? So that by the time they're teenagers, they can kind of not sweat the small stuff.
Yeah, exactly. There's an example that I share often working in a high school setting. I had a young lady who came to me. She was a senior in high school, and she felt like this boy was being creepy. He wasn't getting her hints to leave her alone, that she wasn't interested. And as I explored it further with her, she never told him to leave her alone. She never told him that she wasn't interested. She just blocked him on social media, which then led him to reach out to her more because he didn't understand why she wasn't responding. And so we talked about setting boundaries. We talked about what's the worst that could happen. We role played it. She left the office. I was feeling pretty good about the fact that I helped her with that. I got a call from her mom 20 minutes later telling me, how dare I have her daughter do something that was so uncomfortable and could be dangerous.
That's the problem.
Yeah. But she's going to college the next year and doesn't know how to tell somebody, no, thank you.
That's a much bigger problem. Yeah. So we'll talk about some tools and skills later on, but I'm very interested in your work with children who faced significant trauma. How does resilience show up in them?
So in some ways it shows up exactly how you would think textbook. They kind of bounce back from the small traumas, the small triggers. In other ways, it shows up as maladaptive coping behaviors, because what kept them safe in that traumatic space doesn't keep them safe or building healthy relationships in the real world. But the reality is these are kids that have fallen, and they've fallen adults weren't there to protect them in places that adults should have been there to protect them. So oftentimes you see a lot of resilience, what we would call resilience, but a lot of reliance on self and lack of trust or reliance on others, because people can't be trusted. You also see young people that...
Hey, Brad here. Would you believe that around 70% of the people who watch this podcast have not yet subscribed? It would mean the world to us if you click that subscribe button on whichever platform you use, so that we can stay connected with you and you'll receive notifications when we add new episodes. We really appreciate you coming and connecting with us and being part of our community. So all the best.
Again, because they had to go through so much, these little things that their peers are struggling with, to them is it's small potatoes. And so they have a hard time connecting with their peers because they're so much older in terms of developmental experiences related to adversity. But they also can do hard things in a way that most kids their age can't do. They have that post-traumatic growth where there's an understanding of pain. There's an understanding of the darkness of humanity and an empathy that even most adults don't have, where they've been there, they've felt that, and they can meet other people where they are in a way that most people can't, even in my field, that most people struggle with. So there's, and I think that gets lost in a lot of our talk about children who are victims or survivors. There's these labels that encompass that child as only that experience that happened to them, when in reality, there's so much more than that, but it gets lost in the simple labels to describe a singular or a couple of events that happened to them.
Many people who experienced childhood traumas, I've noticed, are extremely empathetic. Would you agree?
Yeah, I definitely would. When your worst is worse than anybody else around you, and you've worked through it appropriately, so there's not that anger there, it makes it easier to understand when people are at their worst. It makes it easier to say, you know what, you snapped at me, but I get why you snapped at me because I've been there and I've experienced that. they also have made a lot of excuses for people in their life. A lot of times kids who have experienced trauma from their parents, and people have a hard time wrapping their head around this, they'd rather be with their parents than elsewhere. They'd rather continue to take the abuse than be put into the unknown.
Mm.
And so they've learned to understand and to intellectualize why people do what they do. They also read people really well. When you're constantly hyper aroused and constantly on the lookout for where the next danger is, you read people in a way that most of us haven't had the environmental triggers to learn to read others like that. And so they read others' emotions, they read others' tells and triggers in a way that most people can't.
Yeah, you become highly attuned to things like changes in facial expression, voice tone, posture, constantly on high alert for those signals. The situation might become dangerous again.
Yeah, and you think about it, that's part of empathy, is perspective taking, being able to put
Yeah.
yourself in somebody else's shoes, and emotional recognition. And so those are things that people learn as they go. And when kids aren't good at empathy, so like kids on the autism spectrum or kids with pretty significant ADHD that don't read the situations, that's what I teach them. I teach them how to read facial expressions. I teach them how to do perspective taking. But kids who have been through trauma, they do that naturally because it was a protective measure to keep them safe.
How can we support the post-traumatic growth process more effectively?
That is a great question. Our services are not super fantastic. We do a pretty poor job of catching kids who need it and getting them the appropriate services early. Um, Lack of resources, lack of time, all of those things. So kids just kind of get pushed through as long as they're not doing really poorly, as long as they're not hurting themselves or hurting others, they just kind of get pushed along. So catching kids who need it, catching early intervention is huge. But when it comes to actually like being the adult that is caring for that child, understanding how trauma shows up, really understanding what that child's trauma reaction is so that you can separate it from the child. Again, working in alternative schools, all these kids were labeled bad kids. And they were hyper-reactive kids. They
Yeah.
would fight a lot. They would get angry a lot. They would bow up a lot. They would, quote unquote, disrespect. But when I could view it through the lens of this is their trauma reaction,
Mm.
then they were no longer the bad kid. They were just the kid who was in a trauma space and needed me to back off and to give them some time to reset and to reground. For example, something parents often tell me when I'm doing assessments for kids who have experienced trauma, the hoarding of the food, the lying, the stealing, those are common behaviors that parents get really irritated with. But when you think about it through a trauma lens, it makes perfect sense. Of course, they're going to lie if it keeps them from getting in trouble. If lying keeps the parent from getting angry, they are going to lie. Of course they're hoarding food. They don't know, their brain is set to not know when their next meal is coming. So they're going to make sure that they have a backup. They don't trust the adult to meet their needs. And as the adult telling them, "I'll feed you, it's okay," they're not going to listen. It takes time for the brain to rewire and to feel safe again.
How can we help them to feel safe again? What's the process?
Number one, consistency. Any space where there's instability or chaos, they love it because their brain knows what to do in it. So oftentimes traumatized kids and adults tend to cause chaos without even meaning to. It's subconscious because it's what their brain thrives in. Their brain knows what to do. But if you are fair, firm, and consistent, like all the time, that's where safety starts to come in. If they know every time I do this, X happens. Every time I do this, Y happens. And no matter what happens, the adult in my life comes back and is ready to start over with me again, they will eventually start to feel safe. It takes time. And there's kind of that extinction kind of bump where their brain pushes back against it and it thinks, oh, okay. They think like the behaviors increase as a means of proving to themselves that you're not trustworthy. So there tends to be like a bump in the bad behaviors before it goes down. But think about it. This child, if they've been through trauma and adults weren't trustworthy for the last 10 years, your month or 2 months or 3 months of being fair, firm, and consistent is not going to rewire 10 years of experiences. It's going to take time to get that child to stop going down the highway of this isn't safe and start going down the neural pathway of, okay, let me feel this out and see how this is going to work. So that fairness, firmness, consistency, letting them know what's going to happen before it happens is step number one. And then that co-regulating that we talked about earlier that you would do with babies, you want to do that with them. Not necessarily like holding them, but let's breathe together. Let's ground together so that they can model you and then eventually learn to do it on their own.
Is it a problem when you have kids who come to school and you provide a level of consistency, but they're going back to an environment that's every afternoon, evening, that is chaotic and tumultuous? And is it a case that it's better for them to at least have some time each day in that more stable environment so that they realize the whole world is not chaotic? You can actually find these pockets of calm and consistency.
Yeah. Yeah, that's one of the hardest things about working with kids is that you don't control their outside environment. If you try to bring the parents in if they're willing to come in. But there has been a lot of research done about earned attachment figures and the fact that teachers or coaches, priests, other people in the child's life can make up for poor attachment with their parents. A lot of the research around building resilience, around positive outcomes for youth, suggests that just one single consistent positive adult relationship, doesn't have to be your parents, makes a world of difference in children's outcomes, academic, social, and emotional.
I've seen a few programs. I'm sure you have them over there. There's one nearby here where I live in New Zealand, which is all about being kind of not a virtual dad, but being a mentor of young people who've experienced some challenges. And I hear it really makes a big difference. So it's great to hear that even just one person, when I think back on my own journey, there was often one person that I looked up to despite chaos that was happening. And you really look at that. And without those role models, life could have become quite different. So it's a call to action for everyone. How could people who are out there who want to help become one of those mentors or models? Is it through sports or through school, or how? Any thoughts?
Yeah, there's so many ways. So any type of volunteering with youth, if you Google mentorships, or there's Boys and Girls Clubs in the US, and that's all they do is provide mentorship. But if you Googled mentoring at-risk youth in my area, there will be so many options that come up because it's such a needed thing. And it tends to be unpaid. But if you're doing this for the right reasons, you're not looking for the money. But my only caution is, and I see this happen often, is if you're not going to be able to be consistent, don't do it, because it's just another adult that is proving that adults are untrustworthy and inconsistent.
That's a really good point. If you're a busy person and there's a chance that you might not be there some Fridays or whenever it is, maybe wait until you do have the space to be consistent. Yeah, makes a lot of sense. So how do we build a culture of resilience in the home and in our schools?
So again, allowing that space to make mistakes. Honestly, in my own house, I have 4 kids. I homeschool, have been since post-COVID. And what we've done is we create a space where it's better to problem solve than it is to ask me for help. And so ever since they were little, we'd push them outside, go play. And if they come to us for problem solving, we're happy to help them problem solve, but they also have to do a chore. And so washing the dishes or solving your own problems. And most kids are like, we'll solve our own problems. So it works. But as adults, you also have to model it. So as the adult in the classroom or as the adult in the home, learning to regulate your own emotions and modeling regulating those emotions is huge. So you don't go behind a closed door and do your deep breathing. Instead, you say, you know what? You two yelling at each other is getting me really stressed out, and I'm trying not to yell too. So I'm going to take a couple of deep breaths. You two can do deep breaths with me if you want, but mommy's got to calm down a little bit. And so you're modeling that self-regulation. You're modeling, I know I'm getting angry because I'm starting to clench my fist or because I want to yell. And so when you build a culture in your family of talking about the feelings, of identifying the feelings, of catching when you're starting to, as we say in the field, flip your lid. So like this part of the brain isn't working anymore and you're just on survival mode. If you model that and it just becomes part of how you talk about experiencing life, then your kids start to do it. And really good social emotional learning programs in schools, the few that there are, they model that too. And if the teachers buy in and are doing it in classroom, you can see whole classroom shift and be able to engage in behavior management through managing their emotional reactions.
I love that. So you're basically narrating your experience so that they understand what you're doing and they'll learn from that by saying things like, I am feeling a little frustrated right now. So what I'm going to do is, and it might be to take a break, or it might be I'm going to focus on what went well, or whatever it is. But that is modeling cognitive behavioral therapy, or whatever it is that you're doing in real time, or, I'm able to calm myself. Let's take a moment because I don't want to be angry with you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it's no different than teaching them how to do a chore or how to do their math homework or anything like that. It's just we take for granted that social emotional learning happens through observation, and it does. But if we're not doing it well as the adults, then our kids aren't learning it well. And the reality is, with as much stress as everybody has in today's world, none of us are doing it well enough that our kids are going to get it without some added talking through and purposeful modeling of it.
I'm interested in what you said earlier about giving them choices. And I do that with my daughter. I'll say, for example, okay, Sunday, we've got two options because she's not big on big, long nature walks. I don't know if many kids are, but I kind of will say, so we've got two options. One is to go for a long walk in that forest, or we'll walk up that hill. And if I just gave one option, I know she would say no. But by giving two options, she'll choose the hill because it's familiar and it's not going to take 4 hours or whatever. Is that a good approach rather than just saying, we are doing this and there's no choice?
Yeah, it's a fantastic approach for all kids, but especially for kids who have experienced trauma because they haven't had control in their life. They have no sense of empowerment. So when you give them the choice, when you allow them choice wherever you can, it allows them to start to feel that sense of empowerment, that sense of I control what happens. And I even do it when it's negative consequences. So talking about that fair, firm, consistent. Hey, you can sit down and finish your homework, or you can throw a fit and the consequence is XYZ. So you allow them full control. And it takes the stress off the parent too. It's not me taking away your cell phone. It's you choosing to not get ready in the morning. And so you don't get your 10 minutes on your phone before the bus comes. So you create an environment where there are choices and where the child is the responsible one for getting the consequences that they want or don't want.
A few years ago, I drew some kind of mind maps or workflows explaining to my daughter, okay, so right now you're in this state, you're feeling extremely angry or sad or whatever it was. Here's a workflow. We can either continue like this and go to school, or we can change it and go to school. Both destinations are the same, but there are two pathways there. And that seemed to work really well. So that's just a little tip for parents out there. Draw it as a kind of workflow. And it makes a lot of sense to say, well, we're going there no matter what, but there are two ways and it's up to you to choose.
And kids' brains, I mean, adult brains too, they love the images. Being able to see it is different than adults telling them how it's going to be.
Yeah, exactly. You touched on phones. I know it's a contentious topic. Technology and young people, it's becoming a problem. I see a wide spectrum. Some people are like, my child is not getting a phone until they're 18, and that causes a whole lot of drama in itself. And others, you know, here's an iPhone 14 for my 2-year-old. What are your
Mhm.
thoughts?
So, because I work in the anti exploitation and anti child trafficking space, I probably have more knowledge than the general parent does. My own kids, personally, they have a flip phone, so
Yeah.
they can make their calls, they can text their friends, but they have no internet capabilities. We do homeschool, so they have access to the internet and online through homeschooling. But I do keep an eye on what they're watching and what they're doing. I think the biggest thing is oftentimes parents don't set boundaries or limits on the phones until it's already a problem.
Yeah.
And it's like giving a kid a plate full of cookies and then deciding, actually, you can only have one and taking the rest away. They had everything at their fingertips and now it's gone.
Yeah.
So often when I talk to parents about safe phone and computer usage, especially around the exploitation space, it is start those conversations early and often, let them know what they're going to run into. Again, this is that place where as parents, we try to protect them from the dangers of the world. But the reality is they find those dangers before we think they're going to. For example, the average age to come across pornography is 12.
Wow.
Yeah.
Mm.
And so, how many people are having conversations with their 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds about coming across these kinds of things and what to do when they do? And so, really doing your research as a parent as to what dangers are out there, as to what types of approaches you want to take, whether it's giving them a flip phone. There's a thing called the Bark app. It's my favorite one for parents to be able to keep an eye on what their kids are doing online, checking their phones regularly, whatever rules you're going to put in place. If you can, if your kids are not already too old, go ahead and figure that out when they're really young and just make that the expectation. Like my kids do not have any electronics in their room at night because with my work with kids and my work in this exploitation space, almost all of the examples that I've had, almost all of the cases that I've had where kids have been addicted to pornography, have been caught up in sexploitation, have engaged in have had bullying behaviors, suicidality, it's always at night. And it's when kids are sneaking phones into their rooms and parents are sound asleep and have no idea it's happening.
So you really do need to manage the access to that device and just make it a habit from a very young age. And right, some of them might say, but it's not fair because my friend is on TikTok at night and I don't even have TikTok. Well, that
Mhm.
when you're 18, you can choose, I suppose,
Yeah.
is the approach.
Yeah, and I try to be honest with them.
Mm.
The reason that I do this, and I explain, your brain is not developed. It's not made to make these kinds of decisions. And oftentimes at your age, you make decisions based on feelings, and that's not the best way to make these decisions. But, and also, and parents don't like this, I leave my phone in the kitchen too. We all leave
Yeah,
our phones in the
that's the
kitchen.
key.
And so it's the parent, like a parent who's on their phone typing away saying, nope, get off your phone. That's not going to work. As a parent, you have to be willing to make the same sacrifices that you're asking your child to make and showing them we don't use our phones at the dinner table. We don't have our computers out. When we're out in public, we turn them over or they stay in a pocket. And so you build that culture in the same way that you're building that culture of resilience. And you as the adult have to play the game too.
Yes, it's just as in an organization. So I run a lot of workplace training programs through the Resilience Institute. And the most important aspect of real transformation is that leaders have to walk the talk. If the leader is saying, all of you practice tactical calm breathing and, learn how to reframe situations, all of you do it, but I'm still going to continue in the same way,
Mm-hmm.
culture doesn't change. So start from the top. And in this case, it's parents and teachers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah,
Mm.
and that's why a lot of the social emotional programming in schools doesn't work. So I do some consultations with schools and really go in and like kind of live in the school space for 3 to 5 days and talk to a lot of the constituents, the teachers, the parents, the students. And overwhelmingly, the students say the teachers don't buy what they're training us. We have this social emotional programming, or we have these groups where we're supposed to talk about social aspects, but the teacher doesn't think it's important, or the teacher says we're not doing it. And so these kids aren't getting what their parents think they're getting, aren't getting what their administrators think they're getting, and they're not getting that social learning because the teachers don't buy it.
What can we do to convince teachers, or to at least equip them with tools so that they can model resilience? I guess there are some situations where a teacher just doesn't want to change. They're there. This is life. They're potentially not really enjoying it that much. But in my experience, a lot of teachers are pretty open to tools and techniques that will help them with their own well-being and mental fitness, as well as in the classroom.
Yeah. I think what I've found, and what I felt as a teacher, is teachers don't have choice. They just get told to do this program. They're not told why to do it. They're not told the reasoning behind it. They're usually not given appropriate training to do it. They're just given a curriculum and told to go do it. And that happens not just in the social emotional space, but everywhere, especially post-COVID, or during COVID and post-COVID. And so teachers feel burnt out. I actually did my dissertation on teacher-student relationship quality and the impact of burnout and cultural competency on that. And being an overachiever, I did mixed methods. So I interviewed the teachers who scored the highest in teacher-student closeness and the lowest in conflict. So above the mean and below the mean, the ones who were both sides. And overwhelmingly, the teachers who saw themselves as more than just a teacher. They saw their role as building strong humans, as supporting children. They tended to feel less burnt out, and they tended to build better relationships with the kids because they recognized that their role wasn't just teaching, and they felt some sense of ownership in the work that they do. And so it really does, it goes beyond what we teach teachers and goes into that like larger culture of education. What is the role of a teacher? Because those that do it well, they don't just see themselves as a teacher. They see themselves as a village that supports the child. And so if our educational system helped bolster that, I think that teachers would be more willing to try some of these other things. But for a lot of them, they're burnt out. And so they see it as just one more thing that they're supposed to do. They're higher emotional exhaustion, lower sense of personal accomplishment, and they tend to see the kids as like problems and not as actual human beings, which is that depersonalization part of burnout.
Any tips for bouncing forward from burnout for teachers?
Yeah, so this is an interesting one. I kick myself for not publishing this study, but I did a meta-analysis of burnout interventions for helping professions, teachers, nurses, doctors, etc. And what we found was that they're not statistically significantly helpful, any of the interventions. I scoured hundreds of articles and put them into this meta-analysis. And what it boils down to is that by the time that people were put into these interventions, they were already full out burnt out. And none of the interventions made a difference, because true burnout prevention has to start before you're full burnt out. It has to start at that beginning of emotional exhaustion. And honestly, it should start well before that with just your general self-care. And I'm not talking a bath, like taking a bath or taking a day off work. I'm talking like self-care as a way of living. To bolster you against those stressors so that when stress comes at you, your baseline's low enough that you can effectively manage the stressors, and that you can catch yourself when you're starting to feel emotionally exhausted and get the additional interventions you need before you hit that depersonalization / cynicism and the reduced feelings of accomplishment.
It's sad when you consider teachers who are so critical in terms of being stewards of the next generation, feeling so chronically fatigued and being burnt out at the bottom of the spiral. And I love what you said about reconnecting them with a sense of purpose, because purpose can truly shift our state. When you feel like I'm here, I'm really making a difference. So a call to action there for schools is to help teachers remember how important their role is. That's the first and most important step. And then secondly is to model and encourage rhythms of self-care. What might be some of those tools? Is it obviously a good night's sleep, regular movement? I mean, it's not really ice baths and saunas and all the things that people talk about. What else would you recommend?
Yeah, so I actually am finishing up a workbook that I created for these caseworkers that I'm working with in Uganda. I was like, if I'm going to write it, I might as well write it for everything. So 75% of the way through. And it does boil down to lifestyle changes and interventions. So the lifestyle changes were what you were touching on. Getting enough sleep, eating properly, drinking enough water, getting outside into nature and some sunlight on your face, moving your body, basically getting those natural endorphins running, and taking care of your body takes care of your brain and helps you be on at least a homeostasis level that's healthy. Yeah. And then you touched on it, and this is one of my favorite things to do with students and with providers, and that's do a value sort. Figure out what your core values are and find ways to live those values every day. It's really hard to feel a sense of reduced personal accomplishment if you're living your values. It's when we're not living our values and we have that dissonance that we really start to go into that spiral. Finding joy in every day, things like that. And then the interventions, different ones work for different people. That's why I wrote like 50 pages of things. Some people do really well with meditation and a couple of deep breaths. Some need a more active, go take a mindful run and just pay attention to what's happening around you. But the reality is healthy lifestyle is step number one. With a healthy lifestyle, your brain is in a better place to be able to manage the stressors. And then step number two is self-awareness, being able to catch in your body when you're starting to feel emotionally exhausted, when you're starting to feel stressed, when you're starting to feel overwhelmed, so that you can do those 30-second interventions or the deep breathing before you're at the top and you're already burnt out. And those 30 seconds of breathing are not going to do anything because you're too far gone.
Yeah, absolutely. I particularly like what you said about values because my forthcoming book is called Start with Values. And I pretty much have spent a year and a half looking at ways to both discover your values and bring them to life through daily practices, habits, tools, because it makes a huge difference. If you realize and you're clear about the fact that you value creativity, fitness, and kindness. Okay, well, now what can I do each day to live those values, building up some habits and tools and whatever else is going to help you along the journey so that you're actually living a values-aligned life. And from my research and experience, that immediately dissolves most of the low-level stress and anxiety you feel, because you can use your values as lenses through which you observe the challenge. Can I be kind right now? Okay, I'm feeling a little fatigued. Can I activate my value of fitness and do a little bit of movement? Or have I not been creative this week? That's one I noticed personally, is if I haven't done anything creative over the course of a week, I start to feel fatigued. I start to lose passion, lose enthusiasm. And it's so easy. Just block out some time and work on something creative, and suddenly you feel a whole lot more energized. Does that resonate?
Yeah, it definitely does. I actually did. I made some of my family friends do an experiment with me, where we spent 6 months as individual families, living our values purposefully. And so each family came up with their values, however they chose to. And then each family kind of checked in and gave their feedback and how they were going about living the values and what that was like. And again, it goes back to the modeling and creating a culture as a family system, identifying the values together, what matters to us as a family, and purposefully integrating it into our lives. It made a big difference. And it opened conversations that I think parents don't often have with their kids. And my kids were young. I think my youngest was 3. So they were 3 to 7, and they were able to have a conversation about what matters to them and why it matters to them. So I do think that it's key to purposeful living, and purposeful living is key to contentment. I'm not going to say happiness because happiness ebbs and flows, but contented living. But I also think oftentimes we have these kinds of conversations, and people who live in spaces where they don't have the ability to find a job that meets values and those kinds of things, they feel like they're not a part of this conversation. And I just want to highlight, having worked with lots of teenagers who have no control over their lives, and adults who are truly working to survive, there are still ways to live your values purposefully. It might not be that your job meets all your values, but if you value kindness, that can live in all of your jobs. If you value meaningful work, and you can figure out how your work adds meaning or adds value to the population, or even just that it adds value to your family because it pays for their dinner, being able to reframe things, I've seen it lead to the same positive outcomes for those who have very limited flexibility and control of their lives versus those who can just do whatever they want whenever they want.
Yeah, I've worked with people, for example, a nurse who just through a mental shift went from all I do is deal with problems day in and day out to I am here for people in their darkest moments. And she said that subtle shift in perspective completely changed how she viewed her work. She felt values aligned. She was back working from a place of service.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I saw that in the participants that I did with my dissertation as well, this idea that when they saw their role as something more, they were more willing to step up and to lean into some of the things that make that job hard because they had a purpose and a meaning for doing the hard things.
Can you tell us a little bit about Uganda? Most people will never go there, and it's certainly on my bucket list. But tell us a little bit about your experience.
Yeah, so I work for a nonprofit, like I said, that addresses child sex trafficking and exploitation, both domestically and abroad. And with our partner organization over in Uganda, ACOA, we were brought in initially to train the police. It was part of their MOU, understanding with the government to provide training in sex and gender-based violence and human trafficking. So most of my organization is more the rescue side, the training of the cops. But I was brought in to originally train the police and military in forensic interviewing of children. How do you get a child to talk to you when they just had trauma? How do you get them to trust you? How do you build that relationship and rapport? And in doing that, I then leaned further into working with the partner organization and also provided some ongoing training related to play therapy techniques. How do we catch that a child is in a trauma reaction, and how do we pull them out of it? So if a child freezes on me, or they're just like, I want to go, I want to go, I want to go, how do I help them to feel safe, help them to feel secure, maybe get some more information from them because they're trying to find family members, loved ones, appropriate information to persecute the people who had abused them, but also make them feel safe and help them on the path towards healing. And to do it in a way where the child feels like they're seen, like they're loved, not like they're being interrogated, as well as self-care. So when these, we see tough things here in the U.S., but some of the stories that they have over there are really hard to sit with. And they're talking to children who have witnessed parents being killed, who have witnessed parents killing their siblings, who have been beat up or physically or sexually abused by parents, by people in the community, and you're asking them to tell their story. And so that vicarious trauma of being in that space all the time is absolutely exhausting and draining. So we work a lot on self-care strategies that help the professional, but that they can also teach to the child.
Amazing work. Yeah. Must be very fulfilling equipping these people with the skills that they need to help others at scale, because it will have an incredible ripple effect. And that's often the driving force behind the work that we do, is that it's that ripple effect of building resilience, not just with one person, but the community at large. Ashley, how could people connect with you, follow your work? Where would you like them to go?
Yeah, so if you're interested in the nonprofit side of things and in my work in that space, foundationsentinel.org is the website. You can find me on LinkedIn, Ashley Poklar. That's probably the best way to follow everything I do. And then I have a like my own business that I do a lot of parent consults, assessments for kids. There's some free resources there on how to talk to your kids about crises, navigating the online spaces, those kinds of things. And that's at apoklarponders.org.
Excellent. Ashley, thank you so much. I've really enjoyed the conversation. I've learned a lot, and I'm sure it's been valuable for everyone out there. We look forward to reconnecting again in the future. Thank you again.
Thank you.